Welcome back to Crosstabs. I'm your host, Farrah Bostic. I've spent about 25 years in and around the advertising industry. I started as a copywriter. I became a brand strategist. I went into market research. Now I do a little bit of everything. I spent a lot of time thinking about the way that industry kind of passes without notice. It's almost like a business industry secret. It is, however, a huge industry, many, many, many billions of dollars. Thousands of people work in it. It is responsible for the internet that we have today. And I'm serious about this. I mean it literally. The ad industry used to be built really just on propaganda. When you picture advertising, you probably picture Mad Men and Don Draper and all of that. And in those days, there wasn't a ton of measurement. There was some. It was comparatively rudimentary to what we have now. They could estimate audience sizes. Nielsen families kept diaries where they wrote down what shows they watched. How accurate they were is kind of anybody's guess. But now it is actually built on two things. And that is still propaganda, still delivering messages that we want to bring to your attention, chiefly about brands. But it is also increasingly about surveillance. And I say surveillance rather than measurement, because we're not really just trying to say, we wanted to get this message in front of an audience of X size. We also want what we call in the industry attribution. We want to be able to connect an individual user's impression on a piece of brand communication with a purchase or some other behavior at kind of the end of the chain. We want to be able to say to our clients that their investment in advertising can be connected to their revenue or sales. And this is something that you didn't used to be able to do, and you can do now because digital. And the thing about that is that it wasn't as easy as we thought it was going to be from the start. And now what we have is a lot of perverse incentives for that surveillance, propaganda flywheel to keep going. And a lot of that is because of attribution. But a lot of that is because of other things that happened in the evolution of the internet, prodded on by people who work in advertising. So as social networks grew, it wasn't like the head of marketing at Coke who would ask for more surveillance, more features they could use to advertise to you. It was actually their ad agencies who were having those conversations, their media buying agencies. I was in some of those meetings. In effect, we pushed Facebook to sell ads. Now, we had help. Their venture capital backers wanted them to monetize, and they were big proponents of the idea of network effects. The more users you have, the more users you get. And the more users you ultimately get, the more ways you have to monetize them later. And advertising was an obvious, low-hanging fruit way to do that, because the thing about advertising is it chases what's cool. It chases young consumers, it changes large groups of consumers, and it chases whatever the shiny object of the week is. That is just true about the culture of marketing. So we went through these progressions. We had the social graph where your feed was based on who you knew, and that was great because then we could find out who you knew, but we could also get you to know brands. And so we had this whole period of time where it was about user-generated content and participatory brand experiences and yada, yada, yada. Then we saw the turn to the interest graph, where your feed was now based on your interests as well as who you were connected with and who you followed. That also seemed perfect for us. We can now get really specific in our targeting. We could target you specifically at the right time with the right message. And that would give us this new tradition that we call micro-targeting and growth hacking and all of that stuff. They sold more advertising. They being the social networks, they started to sell more advertising. They built self-service targeting tools and ad buying tools. Anybody with $1 could buy a certain amount of advertising. And so this really is what constructed this universe in which digital advertising in particular, but now most advertising is digital. We have podcasts, we have digital radio, we have digital outdoor, we have digital print, we have digital TV, we have the streaming services, we have the social networks. It's all digital now. And so that is why now the fundamental components of advertising, more than ever, are about these two pillars of propaganda and surveillance. You can call them analytics if you want to, but it's surveillance. In a way, the ad industry kind of built this contraption that you might call a car, and then we gave the keys to Mark and Elon. And what did you get, member of the audience? You got what Cory Doctorow calls enshittification. You got bad experiences that are optimized for attention and are optimized for conversion. You got feeds full of bots and sock puppet accounts and a bunch of other inauthentic accounts. You got slop. You got vitriol. You got disinformation. You got deepfakes. You got revenge porn. Now, you'd think that the desire of advertisers, the companies themselves, the brands themselves, for brand safety would stop this sort of thing, that Coke wouldn't want to be next to Nazis in your feed, and I can assure you they do not. But the truth is, the ad-supported social network is actually a fraud-supported social network. Fake brands sell to fake customers through fake posters and fake followers and fake commenters, fake likes, the whole thing. In 2023, it was estimated that about a quarter of all digital advertising spend was fraud. It was worth something like $84 billion worth of fraud. So, you're welcome. This is a thing that I want to dig in a lot more on, because it seems to me we are living in an information space now that was built by advertising. It was built by the people that I used to work for and by the people I continue to work for. We have kind of lost the reins on the whole thing because the social platforms and Google and Amazon and everybody else, they have taken, rightly, control over the mechanisms of buying and selling attention on their platforms. But because we live in a world built by advertising, I really wanted to talk to somebody who had studied the effects of that world. And so I asked Renee DiResta, who I have known casually for, 15 years. She is the author of Invisible Rulers, The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. And I wanted to talk to her about her experience studying the ways people attempt to manipulate, harass, or target others online, how this is impacting our politics and our experience of the internet, and what can be done about it. She is currently an associate research professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown. She is a contributing editor at Lawfare. She was previously the technical research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory, a cross-disciplinary program of research, teaching, and policy engagement for the study of adversarial abuse in current information technologies. It recently kind of closed and kind of restarted, and she has been the target of a great deal of vitriol from people all over the Quack Internet and members of the Quack Congress. Before we get to the interview, though, I want to really strongly encourage you to get a copy of this book, especially if you work in marketing or communications. All books like this need to start with a bit of background to kind of how we got here section. If you work in marketing, advertising, PR, or comms, you should pay special attention to her version of that section. It is the history book about the PR and advertising industry that I have always wanted to read. Books like this also have to have a recommendation section, and hers is shockingly robust. Most of the time, they're pretty weak. Hers is really specific. I want to leave you with a couple of her recommendations to consider. Platforms need content moderation. I know that people think that that way lies free speech violations. They confuse, as she talks about in the book, the concept of freedom of speech with freedom of reach. You are not entitled to reach. You are entitled to speak your mind. Content moderation is hard work, but it doesn't have to be complicated work. And I think a lot of what we've experienced over the last, 10 years or so is platforms making it complicated. She lays out a pretty simple set of principles for social platforms that essentially come down to embracing existing human rights frameworks and having that be the basis for your content moderation, studying the impacts of your policies empirically, and then conducting transparent enforcement with an appeals process. It's pretty common sense. It wouldn't be that hard to lay that policy out. It would be a lot of work to implement it and to enforce it, but it would be worthy work. Some amount of regulation is necessary. I'm going to talk about this in later episodes, but the advertising industry is surprisingly unregulated. It's not just Section 230 that is a problem. It is also the ad business that is a problem. And it is especially a problem given all the harm it can do. But she also has notes for those of us who work in product design and engineering and marketing. We don't have to design systems to be like this. what content is amplified, how your engagement behaviors, liking and reposting and commenting and so on, how those behaviors are assessed, how content and accounts are ranked. These are all design decisions, and we can design systems to depolarize, inform, be worthy of our limited attention while still being entertaining and fun. Platforms can also put more control in the hands of users. This section in particular spoke to me. Some platforms are already experimenting with these kinds of mechanisms. Blue Sky, for instance, has a lot of these features already in place. But I know I could live the rest of my life without ever looking at a For You page or a People You May Know page or a trending topics widget. Let me decide who I want to follow, what topics are of interest to me, and what I want more or less of. These are also design decisions that the platforms could make. They are business decisions that they could make. And I can assure you that the advertising industry would adapt. These are things that people who work in marketing could advocate for. In exactly the same way we once advocated for using the like button on Facebook as a gate for brand engagement, or access to APIs to help with campaign targeting and delivery of brand experiences, we could be the advocates for a better internet. It would be better for the brands that we represent. It would be better for the work that we create, and it would be better for the audiences we think we're trying to serve. So I encourage you to pick up this book and think about ways that you can start putting these recommendations into action as you engage with your clients and the audiences they hope to reach. As always, if you have any questions or feedback about this episode or ideas for future topics or guests, you can email me at farrah@crosstabspodcast.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter at crosstabspodcast.com to get updates about episodes, and our Friday Topline newsletter, which we just introduced, which will include an essay by me, as well as links from the week that you may have missed about public opinion, public data, and democracy, which is something we all have to keep an eye on these days. So with that, here is my conversation with Renee DiResta. Renee, thank you for taking the time to chat with me this morning. I'm super excited to talk to you about your book and about your area of expertise. But I think maybe a good place to start is how this area of expertise was established, because it's been quite a ride for you in learning about misinformation, disinformation, rumor, just bad information swirling around the internet. And I think it's helpful just to understand how you came to be engaged in this topic.
So I got interested in it when I had kids. I had my first in 2013. I have three, I have a boy and two girls. And when my son was born in 2013, my Facebook feed really changed. I started getting referred into a lot of mom groups. You know, the minute you post your first baby picture, the algorithm is like, oh, I know, we can start showing you baby ads, all that kind of stuff. I actually found it kind of valuable. And I didn't have very many mom friends at the time. I was one of the first of my friends to have kids. And I joined mom groups, and, you know, I started getting referred into a lot of anti-vaccine groups, started recommending a lot of anti-vaccine content to me. And that I found really obnoxious, actually. I really didn't like it. When you join a pregnancy board, really early on, the vaccine conversation becomes a thing. People start talking about, are you going to vaccinate before the baby's even born? And it's a very, very, very vicious fight. I imagine it's even worse today, you know, post-COVID. This was in 2013. And there was a time when I had to put my kid on these preschool waiting lists. You know, he was a baby, but you still had to put him on these waiting lists like years in advance of actually going to preschool. And so I pulled down the California Department of Public Health data. I wanted to look at the vaccination rates in San Francisco. And we'd moved from New York across the country, and New York had requirements. You couldn't just opt your child out of vaccinations, but in California you could. You could fill out just a form, a personal belief exemption, they called it. And I wanted to not be at a school where a lot of people were doing that. So in 2014, December of 2014 or so, right around the time he was able to get his first MMR vaccine, there was a measles outbreak at Disneyland. And I thought, you know, this is so ridiculous. We're in California in 2014, and here we are with a measles outbreak. And this is a disease that is supposedly, you know, not with us anymore. It supposedly just happens in like little tiny pockets. But here we have 200 and something cases. And as people are now realizing, as we have a measles outbreak happening in Texas right now, where two people have died so far, and you see about a quarter of the cases are hospitalized, the overwhelming majority are not vaccinated, it's actually a very serious disease. And I I got really involved in reaching out to my local congressman saying, hey, is there anything we can do to strengthen vaccine requirements in our public schools and our kindergartens and our daycares? Because what I found when I looked at those Department of Public Health data sets was that there were schools where 36% of the kids were vaccinated for measles. There was a whooping cough outbreak when I was pregnant. I got my Tdap booster, my MMR booster when I was pregnant, just to try to pass some immunity on to the baby when he was born, because this was the sort of state of affairs. And I just thought, okay, this is really ridiculous. And the connection between Facebook proactively saying, hey, you should go join this anti-vaccine group, and then seeing these measles outbreaks and things happening in the real world, I thought, okay, these things are, these two things have to be connected in some way. And I got really interested in the question of, why is the conversation about vaccines on social media so anti-vaccine when we do still have vaccination rates above 80%? How do we reconcile what seems to be like a majority illusion over here, where it looks like everybody is anti-vaccine if you're talking on social media? The trend is not going in the right direction, but how do we reconcile the differences between what seems to be the opinions that are the perceived majority if you are on social, and is there a way to rectify that? Is there a way to get people talking about vaccines differently on social, or is there a way to change the laws so that kids are more protected when they go to kindergarten? I actually found it kind of egregious that it was the anti-vaccine moms who were presented as these like warriors for truth. It was complete bullshit. And I said, it's time that we change the narrative there and start a pro-vaccine counter movement. And that was really how I got involved.
The interesting thing about all of this is also, and I don't know to what degree it's a coincidence, but it is an interesting sort of timing thing, because that sort of 2013, 14, 15 period is also, I think, for a lot of us who've been on the internet for a really long time, feels like this weird turning point where the internet went from, for many of us, fun and, great places to connect with other people that shared our interests or that we knew in other ways or whatever, to being really unpleasant in a lot of ways. I mean, you have Gamergate in that period as well. Do you think there's something structural that changed in the way the internet works around that period of time?
Yeah. So, there were a lot of things that were shifting. Facebook originally, you probably remember this, was around connecting with people you knew in the real world, right? It was your actual friends. And then it started moving into people you may know and trying to recommend friends of friends. And then it moved into recommending groups. As I mentioned, that groups engine became a really big thing. So instead of you using the platform to connect with people you had some connection with, even if, 2 or 3 degrees removed, it became much more like, we want you to spend more time here. So we're going to push you into communities that we think you have an interest in. And that is going to become a new social graph for you. So instead of just tracking and, monetizing your existing social graph, they really began making an effort to move people into groups that they thought they would want to spend time in. And they didn't really have a strong sense of any, there was no ethical rubric for what those groups should be, right? And so you did have, shortly after, Pizzagate becomes a thing that the recommendation engine is promoting. A little bit after that, you have QAnon, right? There's no understanding of what it means to suggest that people begin to spend quite a lot of time with a curated community that the platform is recommending based on nothing more than, hey, this seems to be highly active and people sure do seem to be very, very engaged in here. And that became the determining factor. So they would put out these sort of like marketing copy about how it helped people who had rare diseases find each other. And that's true, right? And like I said, I was using it for mom groups and stuff like that. Like there was some real value there. It did provide connection and community, but there was also this side to it where there just wasn't a whole lot of, conscious thought about what made a community worth proactively recommending. And you might recall that around this time, Twitter, which didn't have a groups function that was recommended, Twitter groups were private. You assembled yourself into Twitter groups. Twitter still had a people you may know problem in that it was always assembling you into interest-based social graphs. And ISIS was a thing on Twitter around this time. And if you followed like one kind of radical account, it was going to recommend you more. And so Twitter was struggling with this question of, what do you do when you're trying to figure out, how to be both the free speech wing of the free speech party, but also you have this terrorist organization that has just decided that like, hey, wow, this is a really fantastic propaganda tool that we've got here. And, maybe they'll take down the beheading videos, but like they're letting our recruiters stay up here. They're letting us connect with disaffected young men and young women and sort of shunt them off into messaging apps where we can recruit them to go commit atrocities, right? And so you see the platforms not recognizing just how powerful that capacity for connection had become, just how powerful that capacity for propaganda had become. And so it's a little bit perplexing that they hadn't, because they had sort of touted the power of the Arab Spring, right? Which was in fact toppling governments, but they were toppling the right governments. And so, that was a thing that was sort of hailed as enhancing freedom and liberty. And that question of what had structurally enabled that and what else could those structures do was not necessarily particularly well considered at the time.
I think this is one of the things that many things leapt out at me reading and then this morning listening to your book. Thank God for audiobooks, or I might not have finished it. But there seems to be this, I don't know if it's kind of willful suspension of disbelief in the power of their own platforms. I mean, I think the same thing is true about the advertising industry. That's where I come out of, and it is kind of consistently telling itself it needs to tell its clients that it has a lot of power. It needs to tell itself that it doesn't have a lot of power. And there's this, like, I need a trap door, I need a way out of responsibility here. And it seems like the platforms kind of followed that same sort of
Yeah, well, it was
logic.
a cognitive dissonance, right? Or a strategic, selective, maybe cognitive dissonance, where when you read the advertising pitches, you look how great it's going to be. You're going to be able to reach and target your audiences. You're going to be able to connect with people who will want to receive your messages. You're going to be able to, look at your conversion rates here. You're going to be able to sell your widgets and your shoes and your, whatever it is. Also, it's really fantastic for political advertising, but don't worry. No, it's not actually any kind of persuasion engine, not a propaganda engine, just, advertising, which is totally different and distinct from propaganda. These two things are in no way related in any way, shape, or form. It's bullshit. I mean, come on.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
the fact that we let them say that. I mean, this was where I felt like in 2017, as a person who was saying like, okay, come on, we can't, how do you expect people to believe both of these two things? How do you expect us, the public, to take you seriously when you say this? This was where I was like writing briefings and questions for senators who were hauling them in and saying, we were starting to get a sense of Russia at the time, right? You remember this was around when we were saying, look, if ISIS is using this and ordinary activist groups are using this, why wouldn't state actors be using this? Oh, wait, they are. Oh, but don't know that has no effect, Again, every single new thing we found, no, that didn't work. No, that has no effect. But the advertising does. We want you to keep spending money on the advertising.
This is, I think, one of the other things that emerges a lot when you hear people from the platforms talk about it, but frankly, also when you hear about publishers talk about their own incentive structures and this kind of hand-wavy reference to the business model. And sometimes I hear certain kind of journalists and columnists and things like that sort of talk about the business model without acknowledging what that business model in fact is. And I've actually had a couple of journalists in the last year tell me that, oh, no, we're doing everything to optimize for subscriptions. And I find that questionable when I then actually look at the public filings of the entities that they've worked for, where, yes, subscriptions are a significant portion of your revenue, but really you live and die by advertising. And so the idea that there is no set of decisions you're making that drive traffic above all else to your site. And so decisions are made about how headlines get written, decisions are made about which key photo is used in a post, which stories get posted to social media and which ones never do. All of those things are part of the quote unquote business model. And I think maybe one thing that would be useful is just to kind of break down what is the business model of the social networks. I know that Mark Zuckerberg's answer is we sell ads, Senator, but it is more complicated than that, isn't it?
It is because I was actually thinking about this morning as I've struggled to reconcile my own thinking on this as it's gone back and forth over the last, decade and a half now, I guess. Persuasion is very complicated, right? There is no magic, the hypodermic model is the term that they used to use in communication theory back in the day prior to the 1940s, which was this idea that somebody would like implant a message, like hypodermic needle style. They would like inject the message into you. You would see the message and you would be persuaded, right? That sort of like one touch point would persuade you and you would be convinced. And we know that that's not true, right? We understand that you are going to adopt a belief or be persuaded or change your mind through this process of being immersed in a message, through having it reinforced through a peer group, right? Through having it reinforced through repetition in media, through having it reinforced through it being in the ether around you, right? Jacques Ellul goes into this in the 1960s, the idea of propaganda as a totalizing experience. It has to be around you everywhere, and as opposed to something that like somebody says it on TV once and you're like, oh, convinced, And so this question about how do you persuade, what does it mean to be persuaded? I think a lot of the social science studies tend to assume that persuasion doesn't work because it's assuming that, that you are measuring these sort of discrete outcomes. When I think about social media, though, and the challenge of measuring it, one of the things that happens on social is that it is putting you into these groups, right? So the business model is making you spend time in a particular place. And when a platform, for example, let's just continue using Facebook, has decided that it is going to promote groups, which is what it was doing in 2015, almost all of my posts were in my feed, in my ranked, curated feed, right? Which an algorithm is curating for me. It is deciding what I am going to see when I open the app. It stops being posts from my friends, stops being the baby pictures and the wedding pictures, and it becomes posts from those groups, which drive me to respond, right? To get into the conversation. And through every active response, I am committing more and more to being an active participant in that group. I'm strengthening my relationships with those people. And for me, as a political person, right, oftentimes that becomes a source of engagement, of camaraderie. Like, I'm in the parent group. I'm still in the parent group, I'm in the school board group, like you name it. That becomes the place that you go to find that connection. Like you develop really deep relationships with those people. They become your friends, particularly at a time, especially after COVID, where you are potentially divorced from a real world social experience. And so the business model of the platform, yes, it's to show you ads, but it creates a social experience for you. It creates a social connection for you. It creates a new peer group and a sense of belonging for you in order to keep you there to do that. And that's why people feel so, I don't know if rudderless is the word, but why people right now, particularly on the left, are missing like old Twitter so much, right? Why you still hear them talk with sort of like nostalgia for, oh, I miss my community on Twitter. Where do I go to reconstitute that? It's because, as stupid as it might sound, like nobody thought of Twitter as this place where like, yeah, we occasionally saw some ads, but it was a place where we went to talk to each other, right? To talk to people that you'd never met, but you like internet knew them, right? And so the business model is the ads. The business model, of course, it can be other things besides ads. It can be micropayments. It can be revenue sharing for the influencers who are on it. It can be they're getting compensated in some way as content creators. Maybe they're getting sponsorships and things like that. Maybe there's affiliate links. Like there's a whole ecosystem of ways that content can be monetized. But the business model really relies on creating that social connection. So I think that nature of persuasion, that nature of immersive persuasion in particular, where you are constantly having your ideas reinforced and kind of like having that repetition, that familiarity that comes in that persuasion experience, I think it is very much happening on social media probably more so than anywhere else. And so this, I see people kind of wondering, like, you see the graph of like right-wing opinions on Zelensky just like plummeting immediately after that encounter in the Oval Office, and people saying like, wow, public opinion shifts so quickly today. And how is this possible? It never did that before. And I think it really is this dynamic of that cycle being sped up, people being so immersed in those online communities, that opinion formation happening so quickly, that feedback loop. I don't know. It's sort of it's an interesting thing to watch.
It is. I think one of the things that I don't know the degree to which people who run these platforms are conscious of this, but I was on a marketing podcast last night. We were talking about the sort of idea of commitment from brands, and there is in the advertising industry, there is a perennial sort of cycle of we're going to go for big global networked ad agencies to handle all of our marketing needs. They're full service agencies that can do the media buying and the creative and everything else. Then we're going to decide, well, maybe we're not getting enough attention or expertise or creativity out of those folks. So we're going to atomize the account roster and have a bunch of small agencies. And then, you hire a CMO who used to be at an agency and they decide, this is my chance to build my own agency inside the client business. So I'm going to build up a marketing team. This is the revolving door that we go through each time. And one of the other people on the show was talking about this kind of reluctance to commit to a long-term program of getting the message out and building the brand. My shorthand for this is a brand is a story we all know. And I think one of the things that is interesting about social media is it kind of creates the conditions for, as you say, that kind of immersion in a variety of brands, brands not always being commercial firms selling, flavored soda water, but also being political parties and candidates and everything else. And so like it's a very funny tension as between the people who are like engaged in like the ad buying platform on Meta or Twitter or wherever, and then the platforms themselves. The platforms seem to have kind of intuited something that the ad agency people wish they could do, but they're doing quarterly budgets through their clients and running at best like 2 6-week campaigns per year and hoping that adds up to something. And in the meantime, that brand may exist on those platforms and be in people's feeds. And obviously we have all these ridiculous situations where like brands are responding to each other's social posts on Twitter and stuff. But I think that this is part of what I think gets into the kind of heart of the challenge for people in understanding what they're actually talking about when they talk about this stuff. And this is where I think we should probably get into the evolution of who actually counts as an invisible ruler. Because I think it's a very, you lay out this whole kind of progression of like, who were the invisible rulers at the start? Who are the invisible rulers today? Is in some respects, not a lot has changed. In other respects, everything has changed. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about the phrase invisible rulers, how it started, how it's going.
So it comes from Edward Bernays in 1929 in the book Propaganda. And I think it's important to note that propaganda wasn't a pejorative at the time, right? It refers very much to, he becomes known as the father of modern PR, and it refers to this idea of information with an agenda, sort of shaping opinions in service to the person whose agenda you're fulfilling. And much of the book does focus on the idea of doing it for corporate reasons. And he really emphasizes the idea that the role of the invisible ruler is, so the invisible ruler is the person who is kind of behind the message, behind the candidate, if you will. Invisible rulers are the people who mold the public mind, often completely unknown to the public itself. They think they're seeing a candidate, but what they're really hearing is the person who is coming up with the construct that is the candidate. The candidate is the product for sale. And the person who is kind of coming up with what the candidate is the sort of team of people or persons who are thinking about what the candidate is going to say. And he has this insight, which I think is absolutely true, that the same way that you would sell a pair of shoes, you can sell an ideology. And the way that you do this is by appealing to people in their identity as a member of a group. And that through that identity as a member of a group, people become committed and they become evangelists, right? Because then you feel like you've got, like you're part of something bigger, not even necessarily a political party. A lot of the time he's talking about your identity as, for example, a liberated woman, right? In early 1930. Mm-hmm. So what's interesting about this, as he describes the ways that, again, messaging, repetition, references, creating signifiers of identity. He talks about cigarettes, for example, as a signifier of a liberated woman, yes. Right? You know, obviously liberated women smoke. And so by being out there with your cigarette, you're signifying that you're a member of this sort of class of liberated women. And so this, and you see this in advertising over the years, you see this in public relations, it's just this dynamic of what is the visual indicator of the brand? What do you convey when you put something on, when you carry something? And when you support a candidate, very much that same process happening. I was interested in this in the context of influencers, right? And that same dynamic of people who can seamlessly move back and forth, these people who are speaking to you constantly in their role as a member of a group, right? That is, to me, what an influencer is. They are somebody who is particularly good at speaking as a representative of a niche. And they have to be. And that's because social media, you're in constant competition for attention. And so unlike mass media, where you are trying to reach a broad spectrum audience, with social media, in order to get your initial following, you have to somehow zero in on like, who are you talking to? And what is that small segment of like underserved people that you're reaching? And then you can expand from there, but you start somewhere. And this is how you get, the wellness influencer who kind of brings in politics every now and then, but really she's there just to talk about this particular topic of expertise. And, the audience hears the rest of the content, but she's really there to talk about something else. You see this when you look at postmortems of the 2024 campaign. Look at the podcasts that Trump goes on. They're not right-wing political podcasts, they're right-wing culture podcasts, and the politics is part of that. But he's really speaking to particular, groups of podcasters who are representative of a particular right-wing young male identity, kind of culture, right? And you see these people who are there speaking as members of that community. That's the other thing that I think the influencer does particularly well, is they're a member of the community, so they already speak the language. They're not trying to get it from some top-down talking point. They don't need to be told what to say by a brand. The brand is in fact using their authenticity and is in fact monetizing the authenticity that they already have in order to reach that audience. And so the thing that I find so interesting about the influencer, and the reason why I wanted to focus on them as the invisible ruler essentially, is that a lot of times the audience isn't processing it in this way. They're not thinking of it as like, here is a person who is selling me a thing. Here is a person who is who is moving me in a direction. Here is a person who is talking to me about something ideological. They just see it as like, here's somebody who's just like me and I'm watching their content. And so the rest of it is like a little bit, they're not aware a lot of the time what the monetization process is, how the influencer makes a living, the extent to which the influencer produces content for the algorithm, right? That is something that I think is a little bit, they're not necessarily thinking about that. They see the content when it hits their feed. They're not 100% aware of how it gets there, because most people who have never tried to create content have not actually had to go through that process of like, sitting there and like looking at their analytics and like tweaking their thumbnail, right? and doing all of the things that behind the scenes go into making that piece of like authentic content that really is actually quite engineered to produce a particular type of a veneer of authenticity that is really a algorithmically mediated, if you will, authenticity. I feel like I'm giving you media speak or like media theory speak, but it is very much that like, you're producing content for an algorithm to convince it to show it to people so that they think it's authentic. And it's sort of you produce the content for the audience, but also for the algorithm. And that's the process that's always happening.
I think that was you had an example. I've forgotten the guy's name, but I remember the TikTok videos of like the person who the video that supposedly you're about to get caught having an affair with someone.
Oh my God, Rick Lax!
Yes. And just that idea of like you're making content to persuade the algorithm to show it to people, and then you're showing it to people.
That was such a funny. That was I guess that must have been. I think that was during COVID. That was like towards the tail end of COVID, if I'm not mistaken. There was I have a friend who's a YouTube creator, and I started sending those videos to him. And I was like, tell me why this is all over Facebook's watch tab and not all over YouTube's. Like, I was like, is it just that Facebook, the algorithm has nothing else to recommend? Is it just that Facebook's video creators are garbage and YouTube's are so much better? No, I was like, I really want to know. And this person was like, well, Facebook is really trying hard to recruit talent, but it's just they're not getting very much pickup. So I think that is it. He's like, there's, they can only show material from what they have, but they also keep like suggesting garbage, and it's not really creating a sense that there's a good brand. Like this watch platform is a good brand, and people don't really want to be associated with it. So there is sort of this cold start problem. And I think that they wind up solving this a little bit for Reels, but even so, Reels is, it has this brand challenge with TikTok. So this question of like, what do creators invest in? What is the monetization challenge? And what Rick Lax manages to do, for the audience who is not familiar with this, it starts off with these videos of, women making like punch in toilets and stuff like this, right? So, or women making like really gross food, and you just sort of like watch in horror as they throw more and more crap into like a pie shell or whatever, or like smear stuff on a countertop. And you're waiting for the payoff, right? You're waiting to see what happens. And it's this weird psychology of feeling invested and wanting to see what comes next. And so you do watch past this threshold. So he monetizes it. And it's just this, what starts to happen though, is as the comments begin to reflect persistent dissatisfaction, as it becomes clear that this is not what you might call time well spent, as the comments begin to indicate that people are irritated that they've been sort of put on by this, the algorithm begins to deprecate, to downrank these videos. And then he changes the style to be these clickbaity titles like, you won't believe what happened when she opened the door. When he came in, he saw, and then it turns into this content that's like people running around having affairs while their spouse like kind of haplessly wanders through the house. And again, you're waiting for the payoff. You're waiting for them to get caught. And these videos go on for like 14 minutes. And they also started to run them through the live feed. So they weren't actually live, but they started running them through streaming software. So like piggybacking on Facebook's algorithm rewarding live content for a while. So this is like a blatant cheat, but they do it. And it was just sort of fascinating again to watch the extent to which this is just absolute trash content produced entirely in response to algorithmic incentives, and the users hate it. But it's being served to them, and they're sitting there and they're watching it. And like 12 minutes in, they're saying like, what the hell is this? And why am I still here? And eventually you see again, the algorithm begin to downrank that. And then the next thing kind of comes up. And we likened it to an ecology, right? Where it's like an invasive species comes in and figures out how the algorithm works and like explodes and just dominates the entire ecosystem until some predator comes in and like culls all of it, like burns it to the ground or whatever, eats all we use the metaphor of like cane toads, and then they like, and then the next species like pops up and takes it over. So it's not healthy. There's nothing remotely healthy or normal about it. Right. But I think that the Facebook Watch tab was like the perfect example of what happens when you have algorithms going haywire and people just kind of going along for the ride.
Yeah. And I think once you have these systems, I mean, one of the things that I think about, and this, anybody who's ever read the Blue Ant trilogy, I guess, from William Gibson will know what I'm talking about here. But this kind of sense that, and again, 20 years in advertising, acutely aware of it. I don't think most of my colleagues want to think about it very much. But the reality is, to your point about the earliest use of the phrase propaganda was sort of a neutral term. Yeah. But fundamentally, advertising has evolved into a system for the delivery of propaganda and the surveillance of its effects, broadly speaking, right? Like we build rating systems, we build impressions, measurement systems, all of that stuff. And of course, one of the, holy grails of advertising is attribution, being able to, connect an impression with a sale or a conversion of some other kind. And, which kind of runs counter to the idea of like, no, just steep people in a brand story for a long period of time and let nature take its course, which is how it kind of really works. But nevertheless, you have those tensions. And so we've been in an arms race of sorts, and I say this a lot, that I think that the terrible internet that we have now was built in large part by advertising agencies who, acting on behalf of their clients, asked Facebook to give them opportunities for brand experiences, asked them for, using the like as a gate to content.
Right.
So if you like this brand or follow this brand or whatever, friend this brand, then you get to see all the content from the brand as if that's something most people want to do. But like I sat in those meetings. I went to Facebook's office and said, we want to be able to do this for this campaign. That is something that we sort of built. And then you have people who are trying to make a living, just ordinary creators trying to make a living, doing something that they enjoy, figuring out that same system for its own purposes. For their own purposes. But the other thing that you then have is, well, there's another set of actors who want to have access to propaganda and surveillance. And that's, sometimes states, sometimes terrorist organizations. When you mention, ISIS, the two sides of that are really, or the two types of use cases, broadly speaking, create a lot of challenges for those of us who sort of helped build those systems, because now you get into brand safety issues. Now you get into all those sorts of problems. 404 Media had a piece over the weekend about Instagram Reels taking one of its nasty turns for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah. I was actually with somebody who randomly at dinner started telling me 2 days before that story came out that it happened to him and that he was just down one of these weird rabbit holes.
And it seems to happen from time to time. Yeah. And actually, having read that piece, I rethought what happens when I suddenly start getting violent content. Yeah. Because I had assumed that I was getting animal violence because I follow a couple of elephant preservation organizations. And so they're like, oh, elephants. Well, here's an elephant stomping a person to death. Or, here's someone killing an elephant. Like, I don't want to see that content. But this made me think, like, no, there's just some sort of thing that happens. And what exactly is driving that thing makes me wonder. And the other thing I would say is, I would say there's one other correlative fact for me. I don't know that this is the thing, but when I haven't been active on Instagram for a while, I get a lot more sensationalist content that is just like trying anything. It's suddenly it's completely random, and it's just like, what can we get you to watch?
I've been surprised at how quickly the Instagram suggestions flip. This is very, very innocuous, but I watched Nosferatu a couple of weeks ago, and it streamed. And I was sort of taken by it, and I went looking for reactions and a couple of other things. And that was February 19th. I remember that it started streaming. And I think it's March 10th now. And I think I have been in like goth vampire Instagram since. Now, I'm not complaining. I'm like, okay, this is way better than like mom Instagram, which is where it normally shunts me. So I'm like, okay, keep it going. Why not? Like, all right. I just found it sort of a funny, like instantaneous shift, man. I was like, all the mom stuff was gone. All the but what else it took away was actually the AI slop that I kept getting. And I had done a bunch of work on AI slop, funny enough, with 404 for a while. And I could not break myself out of the damn slop content. And it had actually made me stop using Instagram for a while because I was so tired of opening up my feed to just made up log cabins and fake sweaters. And the only unifying theme with this particular content type was AI slop. And there was no clear, and this has been happening on Facebook also for me since I did that project. And unfortunately, it is very much like, that question of like, how do you reset? What do you do? It seems to have a really heavy overweighting towards recency. And I have not figured out why it is, but that the sort of incredibly violent stuff is something that I've heard from a few people that it happens. I also hadn't really been using it much prior to my my
my
checking on the vampire movie reviews. Yes.
Yeah. I think this is also one of the things that I've thought a lot about over the years is this kind of, I think there's a real assumption that the algorithm, and you point out in the book that like there's no one algorithm, and each platform has some tendencies, and my sense is like Meta is very much recency based, so whatever you looked at last is going to give you 12,000 more things like that until you like deliberately give it other other signals. I mean, I remember I haven't been on Facebook really since like the 2016 election, and going into that election my feed was just so full of vitriol, so full of people fighting, that I deliberately pursued like only liking 3 people's posts because they did not post about politics. Yeah. And so I only liked the things that these 3, and they all happened to have C as their first initial. And I was just like, it's the 3 C's. I'm just doing 3 C's here until I can just get to like your kids, your cute little home business, and like your photography, and that's all I want. That's all I want on my Facebook page. And it mostly worked. It didn't work every day. TikTok seems to kind of privilege what everybody's looking at right now. And so it's like what has the most, and of course it's also delivering things straight to you. And so when it gets that initial feedback of like you watched more than a couple seconds, then they're going to make sure everybody sees that sort of thing. And that seems to be part, the heavy weight of their algorithm. Every one of these is a little bit different, but it does lead to this other concept, which you talk about in the book of bespoke realities, which I actually think is a much more useful descriptor than filter bubble.
Yeah. The, filter bubble, I think Eli used that in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, to refer to Google search, to the idea that, because that was right around when personalized search was becoming a thing. And it was a very interesting phenomenon, or what happens when your search results and somebody else's search results are very different, very divergent. The dynamic of bespoke realities, I started thinking about it a lot more actually during COVID, when politics became increasingly vitriolic, as you note. And I would talk to people who were, on maybe opposite sides of the political aisle, and they would be very, very angry about something that they were seeing on X, or Twitter. It was still called Twitter then. They would sort of share it into these, like, everybody had kind of, popped off into these little DM groups, right? WhatsApp groups and stuff by this point. And they'd be tossing in these URLs. Why aren't you mad about this? Why aren't you reacting to this? And I'm like, I don't even see it. Like, you don't understand the extent to which I don't even see this. This is just not even on my radar. It's not in my feed. It's not in my trends. Nobody is mad about this in my corner of the internet. Nobody is even talking about it. Nobody's paying attention to it. And yet, you're absolutely outraged about it. And it's completely divergent. You start to get a sense that even people that you know well are moving into these spaces where this is the thing that is occupying their attention. They are absolutely convinced it's real. They're absolutely convinced it's true. It is 100% the focus of, a very significant amount of their attention. And it is happening entirely outside of your field of view. And this is happening, I think, even more now as people on the political left increasingly leave Twitter and X. I spend more of my free time on Blue Sky and Threads to some extent, though that has kind of dipped a bit also for me. I just don't see as much stuff on there these days. But with that, again, when I go from there back to X, the sheer amount of, there's this interesting phenomenon happening on X where random people are finding lines of public government databases to be very upset about, and this is public government data that has been public for 12 years, but random lines set them off. They decide that they have found a thing. It becomes like the trend of the day. They're absolutely outraged about, for example, Social Security checks going to Ukraine. It doesn't occur to them that maybe American expats might live in Ukraine. And this becomes a topic of mass outrage. And literally, if you're not on X, you see none of this, but it's getting millions of engagements on that platform, and absolutely nothing is happening outside. So it is very much and And it wouldn't be a problem if it just stayed on the, on social media, I think. But the problem is it impacts government policy now, right? Because these questions of, who controls the government and what information sources do they use? There are questions of how does this get worked into secondary sources of information? For example, generative AI, right? Answer engines are returning content. Right. Grok, for example, trains on Twitter data. There are members of Congress who take this bullshit and write it into congressional reports, and then it sits as a source on congress.gov. And so these things actually do have more sustained impact than just being people who are mad on the internet for 30 seconds. And so I think that question of how do we understand very divergent, fragmented realities, and how do you come to consensus in this type of space is actually a really critical question. I don't have the answer to it, but that I think is one of the really key challenges in front of us right now.
I think one of the other things, as you were talking about that occurs to me in the polarization of it all, is also this. I was talking to Mike Podhorzer. One of many, I talked to him a lot, so sometime recently. But the thing that he observed about the kind of discourse on the left about, we need a Joe Rogan of the left, we need a whatever of the left. His sort of slightly flip, slightly serious response to that was, we have that. It's called the media. Like the whole of the mainstream media is coded to people on the right as leftist, and is tailored to, broadly speaking, fact-based stuff mostly, and certainly is still kind of grounded in that mass media era of shared realities. And you have people who are opting out of that shared reality and choosing their groups instead. But the thing that sort of strikes me as interesting about that is things like these algorithms, like Facebook groups, probably create more of a sense of, if you're not on the left or in the center, if your politics skew right, you probably felt like you were constantly being gaslit by the mainstream media and whatever. And so these groups give you a sense of what you think real reality is. And everything can be kind of reinforcing of that. And I think this is part of what I find sort of disorienting now when I do occasionally log back into X is, like, what are you people on about? And to your point, like, sometimes it's like right fact, wrong conclusion. Yeah. Like your example of Social Security checks that happened to be mailed to the Ukraine. It is an interesting sort of challenge of, it is simultaneously true, I guess, that mainstream media more or less is for the left, whatever the left is in this country. But the problem with that is that, like, it is not, the average segment of a, NBC Nightly News is not getting widely shared on social platforms. That's the challenge, is how do you get into the conversation and get into the shared spaces and into where people are amplifying each other's messages and into influencer discourse. I know one of the things that came out in the 2024 postmortems was the Harris campaign saying, we approached all of the top 10 podcasters that weren't hard right about going on their shows, and they didn't want political content in their feeds. But, Joe Rogan's perfectly happy to do that. Theo Vaughn is perfectly happy to do that, whatever. So the sort of vaguely right-leaning or right-curious podcasters are happy to talk about whatever, other folks are not. Simultaneously, though, the Harris campaign booked an interview with Brene Brown and did absolutely nothing to promote it. Yeah. So no one knew that was happening. What do you think accounts for sort of the asymmetry? Is it just sort of stuck in old theories of propaganda? Is it stuck in old theories of media? What's up with the Democrats?
So I'm an independent, and I have feelings about this. I think there was a long time where I think the left was too precious about whose podcasts it went on, right? And is this person pure enough for us? Is this person okay? Did they once have a bad guest? Did they once say a bad word? Did they associate with the wrong person? Is there a reputational cost to being seen with this person? I went on Rogan in 2019. I got more shit about it from the left, right? Why would you, I mean, this discussion about platforming, I'm like, that man has 10 million followers. The platforming is happening in one direction. Let's be really clear about this. I want his audience to hear the thing I have to say. And when he and I spoke, he's like, half of them are going to hate you. He reached out to me, by the way, just to be clear. I wasn't pitching myself to go on. He reached out several times. I said no, eventually, because I didn't, I was like, okay, how worth it is it? We were going to talk about Russia. I was hesitant. But I just didn't. Sam Harris was the one who originally made the suggestion. And, and I've done Sam's podcast several times, and I think Sam's fantastic. And even there you get the Sam has opinions about atheism or whatever it is, or about Muslims, or, name the controversy. And you just get into these, you can't go into this space because if you do, you're assumed to have magically absorbed all of the opinions that the host has. And you're not seen as a separate person with separate opinions having a debate or a discussion or a dialogue. It somehow becomes like you're tacitly endorsing everything they have ever said or will ever go on to say. I think it's a terrible precedent, and I think it put them into a terrible position. And I think that they're still trying to dig themselves out. So that's my feeling on this question of like a Joe Rogan for the left, as opposed to going and continuing to engage in certain spaces where they could have been, they actively chose not to. So that created, I think, some debt and some deficit there. As far as then creating their own spaces, it is, I think, right-wing culture, a lot of what's happening with podcasting is an extension of talk radio, right? It's an extension of that dynamic of, again, just a more casual delivery style, say what's on your mind. It's off the cuff. It's free. It's, it's a very different type of content. It's not really concerned about facts. It is much more, it's much more conversational. You don't have somebody fact checking your conversation with your friends. You're just sitting there kind of shooting it. And if you say something wrong, you're like, oh, well, did I get that right? Maybe I didn't. I don't know. It's just a completely different means of engaging. And I think that there are some really good voices that are coming up and that are doing it. But it requires investment. It requires time. It requires incorporation into the bigger, broader ecosystem. And I think for a long time, it has been treated as two separate things, right? There is media and there is social media, and it wasn't seen as a holistic thing. Yeah. The right understood in 2016 and in 2020 that the most effective thing that they could be doing was pulling up messages and memes that the ordinary crowds of supporters were creating themselves. It wasn't like a top-down messaging campaign where we're like, okay, here's the hashtag, here's the emoji, here's what we're going to do today, guys. No, they were constantly taking the pulse of what the random average supporter was saying or doing. They were making the memes, and you would see the influencers pick it up, and you would see Trump be sort of this top tier retweeter, if you will, and it would just make its way up the chain. And then it becomes Fox News is the last step in the process. Fox News takes the messages of the extremely online and says it to the normies who are not extremely online, and just kind of leaps over and, moves it into the maybe older audiences, the people who are not spending all their time on X or whatever. Jesse Waters made a clip about this. I would definitely encourage you to find it. I posted it to Blue Sky. I know other people have shared it too, but he just kind of lays it out there in about 30 seconds where he says, the left is still there. The Democrats are scrambling around trying to workshop their messages with political consultants, trying to figure out what it is they need to say in this moment. And the right is just constantly pulling stuff up from its very, very engaged base, moving it through that process that I just described, which, by the way, we put in a report in our study of the 2020 election. We drew diagrams, Here is the bottom up process by which this happens. Here are the top 10 influencers who made it happen over and over and over and over again when it comes to election rumors. Here is how the sausage is made. And nobody on the other side took that and looked at it and said, hey, okay, someone should do something with that. And, I don't know. I mean, it's sort of how many different ways can we say this is how it's done? I don't know at this point.
Yeah, I don't think you can say it any more clearly. I mean, this is a thing that is mirrored on the commercial side of things, where we have clients. I mean, this goes back so far, the first user-generated content campaigns, and everyone was so excited about it. The research company I worked for at the time did a whole paper about participatory brands.
Yeah, participatory is the word we use too.
Yeah, and it's but you have a client, the famous case at the time was like, I don't know, Chevy or GMC did a UGC campaign and people made ads talking about what gas guzzlers these cars were. And I think, this was also probably this is so long ago. It's like towards the end of the Bush administration. And so that these first UGC campaigns were happening. And so you also had like some vague connection to the Iraq war and blah, blah, blah for all of that. It freaked out GMC. They were like, that's the end of that. No more UGC for us. And so you had brands that were like, UGC all the way. It's the cheapest way to make ads. And others that were like, no, we need more control over our brand. And I think the Democrats sit in the we need more control of our brand camp. And it's very funny watching kind of center left any social network, because they're sharing New York Times articles. They're sharing, they are sharing NPR pieces and Atlantic pieces and all of that stuff. And that's great. But it's not actually bubbling up stuff from leftist podcasters, for example. Like, I have yet to see, frankly, I'm more likely to hear from like the Bulwark crowd that they like Behind the Bastards than I am going to hear that from Democrats that they like Behind the Bastards. Behind the Bastards is closer in politics to what most like of the people who donate via Act Blue, who apparently are too far to the left, according to the Democratic Party, like those politics are more in line with what they're doing at Cool Zone Media than what they're doing at NBC News or whatever. Yeah. I don't know. Brandy Zadrozny is pretty great, but like this is a command and control kind of question, and it is driving me personally nuts looking at the very well-intentioned strategists and consultants saying we need a centralized. They've also misread the right-wing ecosystem. Some folks are talking about, as usual, there's this whole ecosystem where, like, if you want to be a conservative journalist, there is literally probably someone will pay for you to do that. Yeah. And look, when I was in college, I ran a magazine that was funded by the Collegiate Network, which is part of ISI, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm aware of that group. It does not guarantee that you're going to become, obviously, a right-wing journalist, but a lot of the folks that I worked with are now some of the, TCOTs, and that's an ecosystem that exists, but it is actually a very decentralized ecosystem. It is not command and control. The whatever it was, the Phyllis Schlafly, Wednesday morning breakfasts or whatever they were mostly like a, hey, let's get together, hang out, see how we can help each other, but not really like a, here's the memo of what we're all going to do this week. And I think that is one of the big challenges for the kind of mindset of certainly the Democratic Party is how do you get over yourself, frankly. Stop trying to control every element of the experience because it's not really working. And so the answer is not more control. The answer is not, but they kind of continue to make that mistake over and over again. That seems to be kind of a cultural problem, frankly, for them.
Yeah. I don't know what I think right now, again, I'm in academia. My role, as far as I'm concerned, is not to fix the brand of a particular party, but right. But what I care about from the standpoint of where we are as a country is actually that question of what resonates around shared American values for all of the people. And you see this, I think, in the Republican town halls that are happening now too, which, by the way, are going viral in left-leaning spaces, right? You see the Republican town halls going viral on Blue Sky. And that's because what they're asking for is like, why are you cutting our jobs, right? Why is this illegal organization like Doge? Why is it just randomly gutting shit? Where is the respect for like constitutional order? Why are you not adhering to judicial rulings, right? There are certain things that I think like values that people can come together around and do come together around. And I keep wondering, like, where is the momentum around that? Because that is the sort of thing where I would actually really like to see some sort of galvanization happening with that recognition that this isn't normal, that this isn't something that people are not getting even what they think they voted for, right? And that means that there is, I think, a reachable constituency there of people who are just like, this is not okay. And that's not a Democrat position. That is an American position. And I think that's where you get to this question of what does it look like to be unified around that in this moment? And like, where the hell is the messaging?
Right.
Where are the people whose job it is to take that and just like blow it up?
This, I think, is related to, the final chapter of the book is sort of a, what do we do now? And you got to have the recommendation section of the book. And I actually think there's some things in there that I'm going to pull out when we send out the blog post that goes with this, the Substack that goes out with this release of the episode, which I think will be next week, is that there's a lot of work to be done, probably not in this administration, for actually regulating commercial speech. Like it has always struck me as, I went to journalism school. You have to take journalism ethics. I went to law school. You have to take a professional ethics exam in order to practice law. And yet, like in the advertising business, it is it's a weird industry. It is remarkably unskilled. It is remarkably untrained. And there are no professional standards that anybody has ever sort of trained in. And the degree to which there's regulation, a lot of it is self-regulation. So I'll include some stuff about your recommendations in there, because I think there's a lot that I wish the industry would stand up for on its own bearings, because frankly, I think it's better for the industry to do it than to pretend this is not a problem. But there is this other thing that I was grateful you got to, which is the idea of resetting norms.
Yeah.
And this is, in my mind, one of the other kind of great problems of certainly the Democratic Party. A lot of big brands have this problem as well, where they are kind of, they do not actually seem to think that they have the power of persuasion. They're so convinced that the hypodermic model doesn't work that they don't try.
Right. They think nothing works. Yeah.
Yes. And so it's this like work back from public opinion, and you wind up getting, the number of political consultants I have talked to who refer to polling conducted by newspapers. And nothing against those polling operations, but they often talk about issues at a level of abstraction where you are going to get distorted results. And we've seen a lot of these lately where people, do you support foreign aid? No. If you know that it's only 1% of the federal budget, do you support foreign aid? Yes. Like, add one fact to the question and the opinion completely changes. It tells you that like whatever they're answering in that first abstracted question has nothing to do with whatever you intended to ask when you asked the question. If you take those kinds of polling results and then use that to figure out where you should stand as a party or a candidate or a brand or whatever. I mean, the number of times I've been given trend reports that are like, young consumers care about, sustainability and social mission. And it's like, sure, if it's the same price as the cheapest thing on the shelf, because young consumers also don't have any money.
Right.
So like, yes, they care about that. If all else is equal, all else is usually not equal. This kind of chasing around the consumer, chasing around the voter in order to figure out what your brand stands for, what you believe in and what you stand for, and how you're going to communicate with them seems like the thing that is getting in the way of the norm reset. But I wonder what you like. Is that an elites down thing? Is that a society up thing? Is it a combination? How do you think about the way a norm reset would work?
I don't think that there's universal norms right now. So I think that that's really, that fragmentation has happened, right? And I was thinking about it as I was writing in the context more of how do we, even just thinking about how do you behave online, right? When we think about nut picking, for example, the phenomenon of grabbing somebody who happens to have a terrible opinion on the internet, right? And holding that person up and like making them a spectacle, turning them into the main character. Is that a thing that...
Yes, you reminded me of that poor woman who likes having coffee in her
right,
garden with her husband.
Exactly. Yes. I mean, is this a thing that we need to be doing? I actually don't think I've seen that as much on Blue Sky. I feel like people kind of came to that platform and saw it as a bit of a reset. I will say that people on the center right to right who have popped over would probably disagree with me on that. I think that they have felt that like the vibes are not welcoming. But I don't think you see quite so many of these random people just turned into sort of unfortunate avatars of the day. I'd be kind of curious to I don't know that anybody's really studied that in detail, but on X, it was like, this was the whole thing, right? Libs of TikTok, that's their whole account.
Yeah.
That kind of correction, though, that kind of reset has to come from people in the community, in the target audience, saying, okay, I'm done with this. Like, it's mean, it's boring, and I don't want to see it anymore. It's mean, it's destructive, it's not who we are, it's not nice, it's not wherever they decide to go from a values perspective.
How much do you think that also has to do with some of the affordances of, because one of the things you talk about with Blue Sky in the book is that it creates more opportunity for you to customize what you want your experience to be there.
It does.
As opposed to being kind of forced down an algorithm.
Yeah, and the block function is much stronger, right? Much better. So there are definitely aspects of it that do, again, where the affordance shapes like what can happen and what those cascades can look like. I think some of the early culture around the way people talked about blocking when that platform began to grow was don't feed the trolls, block immediately, creation of shared block lists, much more of a no tolerance, just block. I think, again, that culture was, it definitely changes the dynamic. It is very much more of like a block once and you're done. It's very hard to sort of, you just kind of can't see the other content at that point. It's not like X. It's a much harder block. I think the question of norms, though, really does come down to criticism from one's own side. One thing that I've seen on X lately that has been interesting to me is the people who were critics of X when it was Twitter and run by Jack Dorsey, who are now critical of it as run by Elon. There was a post that was making the rounds talking about how, it was sort of funny. It was like liberals want to censor, but Elon wants to turn it into, Elon hates, like the very idea of epistemology. That's a very, very rough paraphrase. But it was an interesting, it was an interesting take.
I don't want to know about how I know things.
No, it was more of like a, Elon is boosting absolute shit, just absolute bullshit, like a complete crap. And like, yes, you had the liberals with their weird censorship regime, but over here you have this other equally terrible thing. And I thought it was kind of a funny framing. Of course, like as somebody who got tagged with, being one of these supposed liberal censors, I'm always interested in how this thinking has evolved and, to what extent they realized that a lot of that was made up by Elon, but whatever. Yeah. But it's interesting watching that conversation evolve over there as people begin to realize, as one after another, these like, Ukrainian social security, like condoms for Gaza, all of the insane shit that goes viral over there day in and day out, or hourly, minute by minute, as you start to see people over there begin to realize that the platform's getting less and less useful as a source of news, as a source of information, you're starting to see some of the criticism come from people who do sit in that center right or heterodox or contrarian space. And I'm very curious to see whether that shifts or moves the tolerance for that kind of brazen, well, we're all just asking questions here, does that, that shift the sort of trend towards all bullshit is equally good information dynamic that had grown up to be, because a lot of what happened was like, if fact checking is rigged and labeling is censorship and downranking is censorship and anything is censorship and all ideas are equally good and we all just need to, to see them all, people begin to realize at some point that also creates an absolutely garbage information environment. They're swimming in it now. And I think you are starting to see some of that pushback come from people who maybe didn't like the old system, but are also beginning to realize that what they have in its place is not good either.
Yeah, I think this is a good reminder for everybody that like people want some utility beyond pure entertainment and owning the libs or whatever, right? There is an information purpose that X served, and if now all of it is junk, even people who like a certain amount of junk food don't want to eat it all the time. I mean, I think this is one of the old sort of things that people who work in news and journalism talk about, of like people, we're trying to feed them their peas and all they want is dessert. It's like they don't only want dessert, right? They might want dessert first. They might want more dessert than you think is good for them, but they do also want something else. And I think it's where I think some of the recommendations you have in the end of the book about giving back some more control to the user to determine what their feed looks like. I think that's, in some respects, the nostalgia for old Twitter is a sense of like, I decided who to follow and it was reverse chronological order and that felt under my control, and now everything just feels like, how'd this get here? Well,
it's the unconnected content thing, right? So the unconnected content, that's kind of what you're describing when you mentioned the TikTok algorithm. It's not, it doesn't matter if you follow the account or not, right? If some number of people like it, it's going to go out to a lot more people. Facebook increased that, and you can see this in their transparency reports. When we did the AI slop study, what we found was that in their own disclosures, they said it increased from about 8% to about 25%. So it's a pretty significant shift, and they're doing that to compete with TikTok, right? But this is when I said then that what that meant for me was that all of my unconnected content were these stupid fake log cabins and non-existent kitchens. And I couldn't tell it that I didn't want it, right? I don't want your garbage non-connected content. Like, please give me something else. Because I had no control beyond sitting there, taking the time to, click those 3 dots and say, don't show me any more of this. And I didn't know what I was communicating with don't show me any more of this. Was I saying, show me no more log cabins, show me no more by this creator, show me no more AI slop? That clearly wasn't what it was intuiting from my suggestions. So I just stopped paying attention. And again, that I think for people on X, they're also getting very much that question of, why is my entire feed like there was one tweet that I saw when I opened it one day. It was up at the top. It had 40,000 likes. It literally said, why is there porn in my racism app? And yes, did you see that? But then I clicked into that guy's feed and I was like, I think he's actually a serious racist. Like, I actually can't tell. I think he's actually upset about there being porn in his racism app. And yet 40,000 people have liked this because I think they think, like I did, that this was a funny, like a wry joke. But I'm not so sure. Yeah. And on that note,
yeah, exactly. Well, I know I've gone over time, but this is, I think, I just want to, first of all, kind of thank you for writing this book, like getting actually like a history of how we got here with the universe of particularly PR and advertising, and those kind of attention and propaganda models are. It's just like it is the part that gets left out of the conversation all the time. And it, as someone who has been a practitioner of it and continues to work around that space, just drives me crazy. So you scratched an itch that I was having. So I'll thank you for that. But I also think there's a lot of really, it is a more robust recommendation section of a book like this than I think you might be used to, listener, because it is not simply like, well, we need more media literacy.
No.
Like there's actual like internal self-regulatory policies that these platforms could have. There are orientation decisions that they could make. There's actual regulatory recommendations. There's things that users can do, and the kind of we'll solve it in 30 years after we've somehow restored civic education to public schools. That's not privileged in this book. So I appreciate that as well. What's a good way for people, you're writing for Lawfare now. What's a good way for people to follow your work these days?
So I have a newsletter. It's reneediresta.com or Substack, whichever. And then I'm on Blue Sky and Threads, and so my website's probably easiest. It's got all my socials on it.
Excellent. Yeah, I saw the newsletter is sort of a new thing, isn't it?
I don't newsletter frequently because I write for Lawfare and The Atlantic, and I'm trying to actually start doing some. I want to turn some of the book content into video stuff. I feel like some people really like video, and I really don't like doing video. But I'm literally like, okay, I need like a nice 20-year-old to teach me how to do video. It's on my list of things to do over the next couple months. So
that's great. Well, thank you so much again for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it. Crosstabs is hosted by me, Farrah Bostic. Production by The Difference Engine. Editing by Allison Preisinger of AMP Studio. Music from Audio Jungle by S Audio. You can subscribe to our weekly newsletter at crosstabspod.substack.com or visit our show page at crosstabspodcast.com. We are now on Blue Sky, Threads, and Instagram as CrosstabsPod, where we share links to new episodes and newsletters. We hope you'll follow us on your favorite platform, tell your friends about the show, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast service. If you want to learn more about what I do, you can find me on all the socials at Farrah Bostic or get in touch through thedifferenceengine.co. See you next time.